The final section of Capital is about how the origins of capitalism, how it developed in the first place, which, if you think about it, is a question begged by the argument so far. In the first part of Capital, where you're considering capital as it operates in an individual week or an individual month, the capitalist appears at the beginning of the period as the guy or the girl who has all the cash, who can buy the means of production, who can buy labour power. In the later part of Capital, Marx has showed how this cash in the hands of the capitalist is actually an accumulation, a sediment from the previous weeks, the previous months, the previous years, and making profits. So it's not that they come down from the sky with this money, that, happily there are these rich people who come along and employ us. They're rich because they've exploited us, our sisters and our brothers in the past. But how do capitalists develop in the first place? And this is also a question for Marx, because one of his main arguments, which we saw right at the beginning, is that this form of production, this form of organising society, is not something given by nature. It is not something that's always existed, maybe in less developed forms, and now it's more developed. It's a historically specific form of production which will last a certain period, but which will be replaced by another in its time, as previous modes of production were replaced by others in their time. And in Capital, he traces the origins of capitalist production. He traces them for one country, England, specifically, because in the scope of the book he can't cover others. And he's very careful here to point out that this is a path which was characteristic of England and may not be characteristic of other countries. And in fact, Marx himself and much more Engels later were involved in a long debate in the late 19th century about the beginnings of capitalist production and the development of capitalist production in Russia, in which writers like Plekhanov and Lenin and many others developed, and Trotsky developed ideas about the development of capitalism in Russia following a very different line from that in England. Elsewhere in Capital, Marx uses English examples as examples, but he says these are examples of a more advanced form which other capitalist countries will catch up with. Here it's a specific historical period. The core of Marx's argument is that the movement from pre-capitalist production to capitalist production is the development of two freedoms. One is the freedom of the worker to seek employment where she or where he prefers. The other is the freedom of the worker from the means of subsistence, from their own means of production, so that they are forced to sell their labour power. He says that for the bourgeois historians, the expansion of individual freedom involved there is the only thing that counts. For Marx, it's part of a couplet. It's part of a combined development, which also involves, for example, all those laws which Marx talked about in the chapter on the working day to extend the working day, which also involves a whole series of brutal laws against people discovering begging, jobless, and not working. And Marx emphasises this is not an automatic process. it's the development of capitalist production. First development is not something that happens gradually and piecemeal. It's something forced along by state power, particularly the state power of the absolutist monarchies, which replaced the old, or modified the old feudal order from the 16th century onwards. It's tied in with early colonial plunder, the vast destruction of indigenous populations, the brutal exploitation, the vast extraction of wealth from areas like India, like the Americas, by European powers, played a central role in the accumulation of the masses of wealth which could later become capital when tied up, when linked together with the masses of pauperized workers who'd been stripped of the plots of land, the local guarantees of subsistence that they'd had in the old society, and set loose to work in the new capitalist factories or starve. So that is the process which Marx describes in these last chapters. He's describing a process particular to England, but the point he's making generally is that the development of capitalist production has a logic to it, but it is not the creation of a natural order. It's a specific stage in human development, which in its turn will be replaced by other stages.